Well, welcome back. One of the people here, well, actually, both of them are quite famous. I think you might have read about Chris. I think he said he was fooling around and managed to find the voter database of several giant countries, Mexico, U.S. Is that right?
So far, yeah.
So far, yes. So anyway, so that got him started, and now and he's been all over TV and everywhere. And of course, Latanya is everyone's hero. Her genius, part of her genius is she's a brilliant computer scientist, but she manages to do research in a way that anybody could understand it, like her work on re-identification. This was an earlier piece of the data map that was so clever. So she bought all the state databases of outpatient visits, and then so she took one state, and then they looked at all those community newspapers, that kind of say, oh, the 66-year-old, Mr. Jones fell off his motorcycle and, broke his arm. And so she used community newspapers to re-identify the database. You don't need, an army of computer scientists or a bunch of big machines. You just need a smart person that's curious. And so anyway, so Latanya's a hero particularly because her research is so incredibly relatable and understandable and powerful. So this is so exciting. This is the next installment of the database, the data map. The data map is different than a database, and no nation has one, so be thinking about that, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I have the honor of being here again, and Deb Hill is a real hero. I mean, many of you, we've been around these circles long enough, you start to learn about all of the incredible battles that she's actually responsible for, that people don't really realize. I was just telling someone earlier that many of the provisions in the high-tech bill really come back to Deb's ingenuity and her effort. And it's just really great. And this conference has been going on for years now, and it's been fantastic every year. She says this is the 6th year. So I just want to talk a little bit about where data goes, where your personal data goes. So if you use a mobile phone, you might ask, who else gets your data? An app on your phone. Now, if you're using Amazon, you would expect Amazon.com to have some of the information. And if you were using Facebook, you would expect Facebook to get some of the information, but not necessarily Google. But if you use a free app like TextFree, you'd be shocked at all the places personal information about you goes. So I'm a professor of computer science at Harvard, and I took a year off and was the chief technology officer at the Federal Trade Commission. And we were interested in tracking flows of personal data in mobile apps. So along with some summer fellows, Jinyan Zhang being one of them, we actually monitored all the flows of personal information out of 110 of the most popular apps and documented all the places that they go. You can find out more about it at that link. And then the FTC allowed us to share that data with the theDataMap.org, so the data itself, you can interact with it. And it has personal identifying information. It also has behavioral information like medical information. And as you would imagine, some of those apps are in fact medical apps. And again, you get surprise findings. For example, Walgreens, while it shared what you search with places I don't necessarily recognize, though it shares most of its information with Walgreens.com. WebMD shares your location with iTriage Health and Google, and your email with Google, and I don't know mosianods.com, what they do. And then there are other apps like drugs.com that actually sends the medical information itself to lots of different places. So in some ways with these mobile apps, we have no idea where your information may go. A few years ago, Deb and I were interested in the question, sort of preceding the mobile app work, of where does your personal health data go? So you visit a doctor, who else gets your data? And we were both around long enough to know that the National Research Council report in 1997 provided this kind of data map of the flows where your personal information would go. And much of this had a kind of shock effect on the debate at the time, which is around what became known as the Hipaa privacy rule, mainly because people were shocked that there was that many people who had your information. And so Deb asked a very simple question of me. She says, who else does it? What would it look like today? And at that point, I think we were about 7 years after Hipaa. And so we said, well, how would we go about documenting it? So we came here in 2012 and said that this was something we were going to do, and that we were going to document these flows. And so later, she sent me a group of students from the University of Texas at Austin, and they spent a few weeks in the summer with me, and we tracked breach notices. And we looked at the breach not from who was breached, but as to what data was breached and how did they go about getting that data. And that gave us over 1,000, 2,000 entries of data sharing. Also here at that time was a reporter named Jordan Robertson from Bloomberg News. And he said, I'm willing to use the resources that they have one heck of a Freedom of Information Act engine at Bloomberg. And so we issued FOIA requests for all 50 states. And who were the major acquirers of personal health data called discharge data that the states provided. And one of the things that was kind of shocking was who they were. They were the analytic. We expected them to be the Harvards and the John Hopkins, researchers doing public health work. But ironically, they turned out to be analytic companies like WebMD would be an online company, IMS Health, and so forth. We took all of this information and we plotted it. And so if you visit theDataMap.org, you'll see this. And it showed all of the places that we were able to document how personal information goes. If you click on one of those circles, it will then show you the names of the companies and the evidence, a link to the evidence as to why we say that company shares information with this other company. One of the things, and then this is a list, you can also search by company name. There are well over a couple of thousand or more of the companies involved on the data, that are listed on the data map. One of the things that was interesting, once we had a data map that had some substance to it, is we began noticing and asking interesting questions. So for example, more than half of the flows aren't even covered by Hipaa. This came up in one of the earlier panels that there's a lot of data not covered by Hipaa. But this was sort of a graphical way to see that in the data sharing we had documented, that in fact it wasn't covered by any regulation. Another thing that we found was that almost every state actually collects personal health information from hospitalizations and visits to a physician office. 33 of those states sell or share that information with others. And so these are the 33 states that make that data available, but only 3 of them do so in a way that's as strong as Hipaa. That means 30 of the states who aren't covered by Hipaa provide the information in a way that is not as stringent. And so this opened up a lot of questions as well about what may be going on there. But one thing for sure is that the data map gives us an example of hidden data sharing. All of that is unknown. And as a result, the harms are unknown too. It's not that harms aren't necessarily happening, but how do you know? How do we show them? And so one of the things that the experience of doing the data map brought us was this idea that we can have actual facts, because so many of the years of conversations and these health conversations around privacy are, of course it's a problem, but no actual example, no actual quantification. And so this began to help us unearth that. Not only harms, but also when you hear about them, it institutes a sense of fear and distrust. So this discharge data, these statewide collections, actually sort of we began seeing these sort of ways in which we could pose questions. So we had heard some stories. For example, many years ago, there was a story about a banker that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine about a banker who took the equivalent of discharge data and crossed it with people who had mortgages and loans at his bank, sort of linked it up. The dashed line means it's de-identified. It doesn't have the name, but it has much of the other information, and would then call in their mortgages or tweak their credit worthiness based on it. There had been other stories about online websites sort of using themselves as sort of honeypots for people to share medical information about them in a discussion, and then using that and linking it to discharge data. And what was interesting about looking at the data map is we still didn't know whether the stories were true, but we could see that they were plausible and we had ways to test them. So, for example, we did in fact wanted to test this, and this is the experiment that Deb made reference to. So for $50, we went and purchased the hospitalizations from the state of Washington. That was all the hospitalizations in the state for the entire year. The number of fields were about 300, so this is just a short synopsis of them, but they included information about the admission and the discharge, the total cost, who paid for it, and sort of these diagnosis and procedure codes about what happened. And down at the bottom, you see some demographics about the patient. Now, we don't see the patient's name, but we do see other information. And if we wanted to know whether the banker could have used this kind of information, we would have to be able to have a proxy for information that the banker held. And so, as Deb pointed out, we use local newspaper, sort of blotter stories. These are information about incidents that happened. There might be stabbings or other kinds of incidents. In this case, it is a motorcycle accident. And the question was, if you knew something about one person, how well could you match it up? And I don't mean probabilistic linking or statistical analysis. I mean just matching it up, word for word kind of thing. And so we began doing that. So 60-year-old, we wrote a program that does it, but you can see it's pretty direct. So Soap Lake, and we knew the zip code for Soap Lake, and a man was male, and we did Saturday afternoon from the publication date, meant that it had to be there, and it was a motorcycle accident. And we were interested in how many times we matched all the records, and it was only one record that it matched to, one unique record. And we found that almost half of them were able to be uniquely re-identified in this way. Now, this had a profound impact on the state of Washington, who, at the time they were resigning the data, you can imagine what it was like to get a phone call from me that says, I just re-identified your data. And she was an epidemiologist, and she responded, she says, look, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. I have another state law that requires me to provide information under their Public Records Act. If I redact the data, then other people are going to sue me saying that I'm not being open. I'm not providing open access to data. And she says, but your re-identification helps me because it gives an example of a risk, and now I can go back to the legislature and I can tell them that there's a privacy risk, and when we find this privacy risk, we need to change it. Within a year, they changed their law in Washington State. So you can still buy this data for $50. They've redacted many of the fields that we used here. If you need a more identifiable version, they have another procedure you go through, that more hoops you have to jump through to get more identifiable data. It's almost to sort of quantify the risk of it. But the example of Washington State was very powerful because it says that something like the data map, something about sort of providing these little simple facts, allow us to shore up our existing society. It allows us to help the helpers, help advocates, help regulators and journalists by providing an actual factual piece of information on which they can use and do their job more effectively. So we wanted to scale this up, and so our idea of how do you scale this up, how do you make this go full time, is it's not like every year she could send me a crop of students from the University of Texas. How do we go about doing this? And so with funding from the Knight Foundation, we've been able to offer, starting this year, we built some technology that allows us to crowdsource the effort. So we're going to have two kinds of contests. One is a visualization contest. So a week from today, we will turn over our entire database that we have so far from the data map, and we'll encourage anyone to submit visualizations of the data. We have a panel, we'll look at these and decide which one is optimal. We'll also have a competition of who can find more of these types of data sharing arrangements and with proper documentation. We have a whole system set up to do that to guarantee a high And so we hope you'll look for these challenges. Look on the website at thedatamap.org a week from today. And the winners will be here next year. They'll be here next year to be awarded, to talk about what they found, how they found it, and so forth. Now, we actually started this back in January, because the Knight Foundation gave us the money in January. So we said, Dad, let's get started on this. And so we began looking around and talking to people, and some people began working on being a data detective. And so I'm really proud to show you who the data detective is for this year. Yes, it is in fact Spider-Man. Spider-Man is my childhood hero. He is, Peter Parker is a regular human. He gets bit by an eradicated spider, and he ends up with superpowers. But what makes him my hero is he does so. He has all these problems in his life, and the media never really likes him. They don't really push him or move him forward in any way. So he does this for one reason and one reason only. It's because he wants to do the right thing. And because he's certainly not getting recognition, he's not getting money, and he saved the world many times. And many of you don't even know that. And I also like his motto. It sort of reminds us all of a biblical passage, to whom much is given, much is expected. But his actual motto is, with great power comes great responsibility. So who actually is the Spider-Man this year? It's a man named Chris Vickery, who I have the pleasure to have on the stage here. So Chris Vickery, by day, he works at a law firm. But at night, he has this extraordinary hobby where he will travel on the off the beaten paths, if you will, of the internet to find databases of valuable personal information. And he does it, he discovers this information. In fact, he and I were just talking. He's discovered personal information, social security numbers, all this kind of stuff, on 300 million Americans. And I said, and I know for a fact I was in his data, and I bet everybody in here has been in some data that he has found. And like Peter Parker, he doesn't run for the glory. He doesn't run and publish it all over the place. He then takes on the responsibility of trying to track down the company and get them to take him seriously, that they should do something about it. And it's only then, when he either has given up on trying to help them get them, or he gets them to do it, that he then turns to the public and says, look what I found just sitting there in the open. He's not breaking into any computers and so forth. And so I am so delighted that Chris Vickery is the recipient of the 2016 Data Detective Award from Patient Privacy Rights and Harvard University's Data Privacy Lab, and supported in great part by the Knight Foundation. Thank you, Chris. Sit here so I can see.
Well, is it muted? Can you hear me?
I don't actually think it's on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now it works.
There we go. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. Now, let's see if we can get my PowerPoint presentation up.
Without showing my email.
Do you want to help me find it real fast?
I'm sorry. No. If you just.
I don't want to accidentally show anything I'm not supposed to.
No, it's okay. It's okay. There you go.
There we are.
Okay.
Okay. So this is an adaptation of a talk that I gave at Harvard when I was invited up there by Dr. Sweeney. I named it Down the Rabbit Hole, My Foray into the World of Data Breaches, Security, and Privacy. And I will be announcing a fresh new breach that I haven't told anybody about except for the company behind it. They have secured it already, so feel free to tell anybody you want about it. That'll be in a couple of slides. Who am I? And I don't know why the font added a little music note there, but that's just a fun little change. I'm Chris Vickery, a 31-year-old native of Austin, Texas. Day job is, as you were told, I work as IT support at a prominent law firm. The law firm themselves don't want themselves mentioned because they want none of my antics. By night, I'm a data breach hunter, security and privacy enthusiast. I've been cited as a security expert by Forbes, the New York Times, BBC, Wired, CNET, and dozens of other publications. Some examples of stuff that I've found, the entire U.S. voter registration database, that was 191 million records of names, addresses, phone numbers, dates of birth. A lot of states, that's not supposed to be out there. Some states, they don't really care, but it made a bit of a splash when I found that one. Sistema Software is a migration, they had a migration archive server that had 1.5 million records, including social security numbers, names, diagnoses, all sorts of investigation records on how they were going to try to not pay out claims and how they were going to investigate various incidences, stuff that absolutely should not be public, but was in a database with no password or username. The Hello Kitty fan account database, it had 3.3 million, mostly children's accounts, email addresses, hash passwords, although they were not using a strong hashing method. An escrow firm database that had over $3.5 million in transferable funds sitting in an open, unprotected database that I could have theoretically figured out a way to transfer to any bank account that I wanted to. The Council on American Islamic Relations donor database, which I figured our intelligence agencies might be interested in. I thought I might get a call from one of them at some point. They had plain text credit card details, as in name, CVV number, card number, everything a fraudster would need to commit acts of fraud. And then another interesting one was the Microsoft Careers database, not because it had a whole bunch of juicy information, but because Microsoft was taking this database and the HTML in it and using it directly on their site, meaning I could have altered Microsoft's website by changing the HTML code in this database. I'm actually one of Microsoft's researchers of the year on their Hall of Fame or something or other. If you look it up, they granted me a free license to their MSDN database people, something or other. I don't know. I didn't really pay attention to it. So here's the fresh breach. SureScripts. They were working with somebody called Jefferson Technical to develop some sort of new portal, and Jefferson Technical didn't put any password on the database they were developing, and SureScripts gave them 62,000 records. This is what it looked like. Patient, identification, name, gender, address, communication number, social security number, everything, 62,000 of these just sitting there. I notified them on June 1st. It was taken offline the same day. SureScripts' IT department is hoping that the records are fictitious. I'm currently waiting to hear back from them. Something I want to point out to you is everybody claims that the records are fictitious at first. That's the common result or common response that I get. Everybody says that. I don't know if there's a law firm out there that's telling people that, hey, if you have a database that gets discovered, claim it's all fake, because that's what everybody claims. But in almost every single case, it turns out to not be the truth. I have not yet announced this to anybody in the media. It'll probably be my next post that I do for the company that I post data breaches about. Here's how I got started, really, with Amazon AWS buckets. This is what they look like. Example.s3.amazonaws.com. The S3 part is always the same for every bucket. The example is what changes. In early September of 2015, I stumbled upon a simple one, sys-prod.s3.amazonaws.com. And this is how it played out. IT specialist finds unsecured medical info of 1.5 million. It was the Sistema Software Company's migration archive database. It included the state of Kansas Workers' Compensation Database, that was 1 million entries, and the California State Association, blah, 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 Excess Insurance Authority. Miller's Mutual Group, York Insurance, Salt Lake County, that was about 500,000 entries. It included things like social security number, date of birth, address, employer, medical history, investigation, and litigation notes. I called Kansas first. The database went offline about 30 minutes later. A room full of Kansas attorneys called me back while I was at work at my day job, and I slipped into a side office and talked to them because it was a room full of attorneys. The end of the call ended with this. Now, Chris, there's no reason anyone else has to know about this. Except I've always been taught by my father that when somebody says that to you, that's the exact moment you need to start telling people about it. So here's the next part of it. I left work at 5 o'clock that day. My cell phone started ringing at 5:04. It was Sistema's chief operating officer because Kansas had given him my phone number. The COO tries to convince me not to contact any more clients because the database has all their clients listed. That's how I figured out that Kansas was one of them. Over the next day, I notified a few more because I was not going to shut up and let this slide under the rug. The COO calls me again, really, really wanting me to not contact any more clients. Says that they've all been notified, which I later found out was not true. And how could it be? There were hundreds and hundreds of entities listed in this database. I don't know how he could contact them all in one day unless he sent out a mass email, which he didn't do. A week later, I had not seen a single breach notification online in any publications. I hadn't heard anybody talking about it on Twitter or anything, and there's so much data in my hands. So I start contacting the media, and I get some government responses. I started emailing details of the breach to online news sites. A few hours later, the Texas Attorney General's office calls me. They know I've been contacting media outlets. I don't know how they knew that I'd been contacting media outlets, but they knew. The AG's office wants my hard drive immediately. They wanted it, as they put it, yesterday. They issued a civil investigative demand for the data. The civil investigative demand, you're supposed to have 2 weeks to respond to it. They gave me 1 day. I don't know if I'd have made a fuss, if I would have gotten anywhere, but I decided not to fight it. The following evening, I spent an hour and a half meeting with them, negotiating an affidavit saying, no, I didn't make any copies of this, no, I didn't hand it to anybody else. The Kansas attorneys had wanted to fly down for that interview. The Texas AG's office told them to hold off. And in the future, I don't know why that's shaking there. Through the Public Information Act in Texas, requested some information regarding this investigation, and they denied my request, citing that they anticipate litigation against Sistema. So that's good. I like that. Here's my legal theory behind how I can stay safe when I do these things. When I find databases that have no password, yet I go into them and copy the data. Some people say that, doesn't that, expose you to liability? Well, here's what I think. Country roads are public roads that, even if they're not often traveled, if a company places sensitive documents on the side of a country road, there's a chance that no one will drive by and see it. However, I make a habit of driving down the internet's country roads. It turns out that lots of companies put sensitive documents on the roadside. Here's a case that backs up my legal theory. Travelers Indemnity Company versus Portal Healthcare. The judge said, exposing confidential medical records to online searching is publication. Publication does not hinge on the would-be publisher's intent, which is very important to me because a lot of companies say, hey, I didn't want to put it out there, so it doesn't count as being on a publicly accessible location. Well, you kind of did put it out there, so it doesn't matter what your intention was. This was upheld by the Fourth Circuit in April of this year. It's only binding in Virginia and other places in the Fourth Circuit, not in Texas where I am, but hey, I can lean on it and say, hey, at least one judge agrees with me. That is Judge Gerald Bruce Lee. He basically makes the point here that if a book is on Barnes & Noble's shelf it is published. Whether or not somebody takes it off that shelf makes no difference whatsoever. Things start heating up after I find the system a breach. I began to use Shodan.io and Zoomeye.org, as well as some tools like MassScan and ZMap to find these databases that have no passwords, no usernames, and are just out there and available. I learned that many NoSQL implementations can be configured for public access without any form of authentication. These are some examples of those types of software. Statistically, this is a data breach storm waiting to happen, because if you can make a database with no password, a certain percentage of people are going to do that, whether or not it's a smart thing to do. So here's a health data breach that, well, kind of health related. There were weights and workout routines and heart rate data in here, but it's for a company called iFit. They are a competitor to Fitbit. They had 576,274 user profiles exposed. This included passwords, email accounts, as well as how much people weigh, how often they work out, things of that sort. At first, they claimed it's a several years old test database, as everybody claims. Oh, it's fake data, it's test data, it's old, blah, blah, blah. I called their bluff. They later admit that it is a database in a test environment, but with real data. That, that still doesn't make it better. It doesn't matter if it's a test database. If you put real people's data in it, it might as well be a production database. Here's a dating app for HIV positive adults called HZone. They had a database, no password protection, no username, no nothing, just sitting out there. Nearly 5,000 users exposed with email addresses, GPS coordinates, sexual preferences, private messages. I worked with the admin at databreaches.net to contact HZone's owners. The HZone CEO threatened to infect the databreaches.net administrator with HIV for disclosing this. He's a guy in China somewhere, I don't know his name, but he is the owner and operator of HZone, and he threatened to infect her with HIV. Here's one that isn't necessarily health related, but it did have social security numbers and sensitive stuff, so I decided to include it here. The California Virtual Academies is a series of K-12 charter schools in California. They had 59,000 student records exposed. Grades, special education status, therapy notes on whether a special ed kid is doing good or bad or what he needs to do differently. They also had payroll files on 17,000 employees, social security numbers, pay rates, hashed passwords. Surprisingly, I was recently contacted by an attorney of theirs to verify that all data was securely wiped, and that was good follow-up. Normally, I never hear from them again. After they secure the database, it just, they never contact me. They never say, hey, delete our data, or hey, did you download a copy? I always let them know that I did, but very few of them, when I find a database, actually ask me to purge it, which is surprising. Alliance Health, they were a pretty big one. They operate a series of condition-specific medical support communities for people with diabetes, arthritis, depression, etc. According to their IT guy that I talked to, he kind of gave me an inside scoop. They mine the user data when people sign up for this stuff and supply it to call centers, and then push condition-related products through emails and phone calls. Needles and blood testing supplies to diabetics would be an example of that. The data mined records with defects, such as an ill-formatted phone number or a date of birth that indicated a minor, were placed in a database table called scrubbed leads, leads that they couldn't follow up on for one reason or another. Not that the entire entry was wrong, but one little piece of it was. Apparently, no one ever cleared out the scrubbed leads table. It had accumulated over 1.5 million records with names, phone numbers, dates of birth, and email addresses, as well as insurance carrier and medical condition notes, just sitting out here on the open internet for anybody. They quickly responded, and they're complying with notification laws. Since I wrote this presentation and originally presented it at Harvard, they have contacted me and gotten me to, write an affidavit saying, yes, I securely purged all this stuff. So they're one of the good guys. Not that it was good that this information was originally out there, but it's good that they've been cleaning up their act. AARP, this one was interesting. Everybody knows who AARP is, the American Association of Retired Persons. They had nearly 1.5 million accounts of people registered through their Life Reimagined portal, which is a side project of theirs. They ignored me. I waited a week, went to the media. An article was posted on securityweek.com 9 days after my notification to AARP. I was contacted by AARP's security group the same day the article went up. To my knowledge, no breach notification went out to users, and AARP never commented publicly. However, I was later contacted anonymously via Reddit by a supposed insider urging me to make a bigger deal out of the breach. He alleged that AARP had conspired to cover it up, and he knew things, he or she, I don't know if it was a man or a woman, he knew things about the breach that I had never told the media, so I am going to believe them unless they hacked into my computer and learned those things. Here's the big one, the U.S. voter registration database, 191 million records. In many jurisdictions, it's considered public info, but many exceptions as well. To this day, the faulty party is not known for sure. The prime suspect is Pioneer Solutions Incorporated and United in Purpose. They're headed by the same guy, a felon named Bill Dallas. He's an ex-San Quentin inmate convicted of embezzlement in the 90s. According to tax filings, United in Purpose paid Pioneer Solutions over $1 million in 2012 and 2013 for Pioneer data, which we believe is this voter registration data. The registered usernames in the database were Pioneer and Pioneer 2. That's one of the ways that we were putting the owner of the database together. We haven't gotten a flat-out admission from Pioneer Solutions, but all the arrows are indicating them. 3 Lockbox was an interesting breach. That's the one that is an escrow company primarily dealing with large construction projects, some of which are public schools, some of which are malls. Their exposed database had over $3.5 million in dispersible funds. They had plain text passwords for about half of the account. Plain text means it's not encoded in any way. Upon notification, the admin requested a week before reporting to media. I said, okay, I can give you that. There was a minor misunderstanding though. He thought that he was asking for a week to secure the database. I expect the databases, when I find these things, to be secured immediately. I'll wait a week to tell the media, but you're not going to get a week for it to sit out there in the public. So when I discovered at 2 a.m. on Christmas morning, when I woke up randomly and checked on it, that it was still exposed, I called the CEO. And guess how I found his home phone number? The voter database that I had found just a week earlier. The database was secured 30 minutes later at 2 a.m. on Christmas morning when the CEO heard that he had $3.5 million waiting to be stolen. And here's one that went bad. Most of these breaches I get good responses for. Some of them, the responses are a little neutral, and then every once in a while you get one that responds badly. This is probably the worst response I've ever gotten. Kids is a child tracking app. The breach that I discovered with Kids exposed, less than 2,000 children, but still, children are children. You don't want them to be exposed at all. GPS coordinates, social media logs, authentication tokens, and over 6.8 million text messages and 2 million images. The CEO quickly went from appreciative to intimidating to accusatory. And this is what he posted on his Kids blog. A database was breached by a hacker, and here are the facts as we know them now, where he goes on to lambast me and call me evil and the devil and everything you can imagine. Here's the fallout from that. Articles such as Chris Vickery under attack after disclosing OpenDB for Kids, goes on attack after database found insecure, child tracker firm in Hack Row responds the worst possible way, and takes aim at security researcher after database breach. Here are some thoughts that I've had that are related to that. I've assisted with investigations conducted by the FBI, the Texas Attorney General's Office, Secret Service, State of Kansas, California Highway Patrol, and others. Not a single agency has even suggested that what I do is criminal. Here's the alternative if you want to subscribe to the CEO of UnoKids' theory that I shouldn't be doing this. You have the example of on December 9th, I discovered a database that belonged to battlefy.com. It's a site that has to do with e-gaming. 89,000 usernames, email addresses, passwords. I classified it as something I need to notify them about, but not something immediate like private health information. I added it to my backlog of breaches. Here on January 11th, 2016, however, there was an actual admitted hacker that hit the esports site Battlefy and released 89,000 users' data. Basically, he found the same database that I found and released it to the world. He didn't try to notify Battlefy, he didn't try to notify the users, he didn't protect it at all. He just released it to everybody. And it made a bunch of headlines because then these email addresses can be used for phishing, the passwords can be cracked and broken into other sites. Basically really nasty stuff that if I had notified them, which I wish I had, ahead of time, this wouldn't have happened. Which one would you rather have? And that's pretty much the end of the presentation here. I think I ed it down to size. I guess we can take questions or...
Yeah, of course we should give you a... We do have time, I think, for a couple of questions. Yeah.
Dr. Sweeney, 3 years ago was the last time I came, and I was so inspired by your talk and what Jordan Robertson wrote about, and came to look at Oregon in terms of what they were doing and with data. And one of the things that was really bothersome to me is that just in 2010 they created legislation to start an all-payer, all-claims database. And so they chose a vendor to store the data, to de-identify the data, to do all the stuff, and then do analytics and whatnot. And the vendor that they happened to choose was Milliman Incorporated, one of the top purchasers of medical data, and who in 2008 was hand-slapped by the Federal Trade Commission in terms of other things that they were doing. My question for you, because I am really trying to look at this issue and think about all these all-payer, all-claims databases, which the Supreme Court has said that self-insured plans don't have to submit information to, partly because it's an ERISA plan, and there are risks associated with it. And I've tried to pull my data, I've asked them to take my data out and gotten nowhere with it. And, but there's another basic question as to when we look at these big data aggregators that are, that a state says is mandated data, is there a way to discriminate conflicts of interest whereby, you know, this company which has so many clients, they do rate filings, they work with PBMs, they, you know, they work with hospitals, you know, that they should be excluded because the vendors for all-payer, all-claims databases are defense contractors, all sorts of people. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So first of all, I'm required to say that anything I say has nothing to do with the Federal Trade Commission. I don't get to speak for them. I don't even work for them anymore. But all-payer databases are a real problem because unlike the hospital discharge data, they're even more hidden. So we can't do a FOIA request against them. They may be selling or sharing or selling or giving away the data, but they don't necessarily have to sell it or give it to us. And so it's ironic that the new version of discharge data, it's all the same as discharge data plus more because it includes clinical notes and lab measurements and things like that. It's far more precarious.
I want to add a comment to this because Attorney General's offices were mentioned prominently and all-payer claims databases. In Massachusetts, we have a law, Chapter 224, that gives patients access to what information the state has collected in the all-payer claims database. And for over 3 years now, I've tried to get enforcement of that law to give patients this information because it's immensely useful in choosing which health plan you want to use in the health insurance exchange, which one you want to select, because it gives you objective information about what your out-of-pocket costs would have been. The Attorney General's office does not habitually go and enforce the law relative to other state agencies. Is basically, they tell me that it's too complicated, that's not really something that they do. So it is a no man's land when the state actually goes and does things like this.
I'm Nancy Anthracite. I'm a physician. One of the things that bothers me about that nobody's been talking about really here is that the governments are collecting this information. And why are we providing the federal government and state governments personal information like this? We talked about how in Germany things did not go well, and I know you'll think I'm nuts to even mention that. But we already know that the government uses surveillance data and all sorts of things that got exposed. Why are we sitting back and allowing all this to happen with our personal health information? For instance, for quality measures, it's going into CMS, into a federal database. California, all the rest of these places that are collecting all this quality measure, it's personally identified. It's all about you, and do you really want them to have all that information?
I would just add one thing to that, and that is, it's not just the government. I mean, granted, the difference between a corporation, Google knowing everything about me, and the government knowing everything about me is that the government can't take away my liberty. They can put me in jail. The most a company can do is make me go bankrupt. But one of the things we found at 9/11 was a shift. Data that the companies had that the government couldn't get, we just saw the government purchase it. And so in some way, the all payers databases kind of start to look that way, because really it's a public-private partnership, most of them. And some of them are just downright private, but some of them are public-private partnerships. And so they sort of remind you of that.
Right, exactly. And it's the government that's also facilitating and allowing a lot of this data collection that's going on with private companies. The wellness thing that I think probably a lot of you had to fill out some very personal questionnaires was a part of the Affordable Care Act, making a Hipaa exception. Now, we already know Hipaa, you can drive a truck through, it's practically useless, but then they made an exception to it, and that data isn't even all protected by Hipaa itself. And when you go to HHS and talk to the Civil Rights Division, they'll tell you they're helpless to do anything about it because Hipaa is so useless.
Okay. Well, I hope you'll join me in giving Chris another round for his reward for it.
Thank you, Chris. It's really wonderful to be able to have a Texan up here on the stage. He's like he is a Spider-Man hero, just like Latanya, and he's from my state. So anyway, thank you. And next year will be good. We'll have you back again. We'll learn more. So and I hope everybody's coming to the gala tonight, and Chris will get an actual award as well. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
and as Professor.
Laptop?
No.
No.
You can
Just don't take the data off of it.
Of course you can.
No,
Of course you can.
I don't know what the next speaker is.
Oh, Professor Ajunwa? There she is. Okay. Can't see always.
Do you need a laptop or you're good? I don't need a laptop. Okay.
Okay,
So we'll
that's
take
good.
it off.
So some of you may remember her from last year, and some of you have seen her amazing writing, and she is actually kind of at a frontier edge of health in